Alright everyone, let's go ahead and start thinking about Chapter 4. Chapter 4 has to do with what we're going to do to actually manage the file system, and there's a whole bunch of stuff in here to talk about. I'm not planning on going over everything in the chapter because there are some things here that conceptually are pretty easy to understand and that I'm expecting that you'll be able to pick them up just by reading the book. And there's a couple other things that are it's a little bit more difficult to understand the concept behind them, and that's where we're going to spend the majority of the time when we're talking about doing these in these lectures. The stuff that is, I think, fairly straightforward is something that that you guys should be able to just pick up by reading the textbook, but we'll still go over the majority of the stuff in the chapter here. But if we go over everything in the lectures, then the lectures are going to be really long. One of the things that you've noticed sort of as we've gone around and looked at some of the things in Linux is like if you're in your home directory, you probably have this group of folders that says desktop, documents, downloads, music, pictures. If you didn't install an X windowing system, or you've got a different distribution of Linux, you probably have something that looks a little bit different, but you are by default here in your home directory. So if you do something that says pwd, what you'll see is something that says slash home slash, and then it has your username in there. Now, one of the things that I did sometime in the last chapter is I was messing around with text files, and so I think I put those in downloads. And if I cd, it stands for change directory, into downloads and do an ls, you can see that the files that I have are still there. So one of the things that I want you guys to take away from this is that every Linux system is pretty much set up to be the same in terms, at least in some elements, in terms of how the file system is laid out. Um, so uh, just sort of by convention, all the home directories are always in slash home. The one sort of exception for this is in root, or is the root administrative directory, which is in slash root. Um, there are sort of predefined places in the Linux file system where stuff exists and where stuff lives, and it's important to be at least mildly familiar with this because it makes it a lot easier to find where things are located in the system. And there is a big table on page 148 that sort of talks you through what's called the file system hierarchy standard. And this is just sort of a standard way of laying out a file system in a Linux or Unix system so that anybody that uses it knows where to find stuff. It's worth talking about some of these directories, but I think conceptually we can all understand why that's something that's desirable. Home directories are always in slash home, and if I know that it's going to be that way on every Linux system that I log into, then I'm not going to have to go look at, say, slash tmp to see where home directories are. I just know they're going to be in slash home. So if we want to go to the very beginning of the Linux file system, you can type cd and then just slash like this, and when I type ls, you can see a list of directories in here. Now these are going to correspond not in well, pretty much to the stuff that we're going to see in table 4.1. And let's talk about kind of what those are used for. The one that we already mentioned, slash home, is where they're going to be home directories for all the users that are on the system. If you do an ls of home right now, you're probably just going to see your username in here. Now, in the other Linux class that I'm teaching, we're talking about how to manage multiple users, and you can see that Frodo Baggins and Bilbo Baggins both have home directories here because they both have accounts on this machine. That's not anything we've done in this class, but what you would expect to see if you did a listing of all the files in slash home is you're going to see home directories for everybody that's on the system. If that's one person, you're just going to see one home directory there. If you have 500 users on the system, you're going to see a whole pile of directories. Each one of these things that's going to be under slash has its own sort of thing that it holds. Just to talk about some of the more common ones, TMP TMP here stands for temporary, and if you go look in the temp directory, which is usually how it's referred to. Just people say it's the temp/temp. That's where if a program or if a user has to create some sort of temporary file that they're going to eventually erase, um, that's um, that's where it's going to go. There's another pretty standard directory that's called USR, and a lot of times people will think that this stands for user. It does not. It stands for Unix System Resources, and that's where a whole bunch of the commands and utilities that we're using show up. In fact, if you look in the table in the beginning of chapter 4, it'll explain what each one of these directories in here is for. And some of these are pretty obvious. Games, for example, I bet most of you are able to game this or able to guess this is going to contain games. So there's there's a whole bunch of stuff that's in here. If you are trying to get into some sort of like attach a CD-ROM drive or a USB drive, that's probably going to be placed under /media. Right now I don't really have too much on that's attached to this system, so there's nothing under there. /lib stands for libraries, and that's where a bunch of the shared program libraries are going to be put. /root is going to be the home directory for the root user. If you want to go through table 4-1, it's probably worth reading through all of these. I don't expect you to have them all memorized, but as a general rule, if you're going to want to be at least mildly familiar with the Unix system or the way that Linux lays out its file system, just so you're going to be able to find stuff if you're looking for it. I think that's probably about all that we need to talk about. /dev contains device files. We'll talk about what those are a little bit later in the class. /boot is where Linux keeps all the software that allows it to start up in the first place. So that's going to be elements of the Linux operating system and what's referred to as the bootloader. We get into bootloaders much later in this class. But this is what's referred to. This whole way of laying out a file system is the File System Hierarchy Standard, FHS. So that's about all we need to say about that. I think probably what's a little bit more interesting, at least from our perspective, is figuring out how to create files and directories and then move them around. And let me just sort of do a little bit of a sidebar here. And this is if you have installed an X windowing system on your Linux box, you should be able to go to it's a program called Nautilus, and now I'm not sure where it is, but it should be under, well, actually we shouldn't even need to go find it under there. We should just be able to go ahead and double click on home. And you can see that you've got something here that looks like a file browsing system. So if I go to downloads, I can see that I've got my 2 text files in here, and that's going to correspond, the information that's in here is going to be pretty much exactly like what you would expect to see in the command line. It's showing you what is in the command line. So you can see if I'm in home gsmith downloads, I can see these 2 files. You can see these 2 files. And for a lot of the commands that we're going to be talking about, you could go into the X windowing system and either right click on things or hit the delete key or copy it to somewhere else, just like you would if you were in Windows. But it's best to learn this kind of stuff on the command line, because there will be situations that you run into where if you are using Linux on a system that doesn't have X windows, that it won't be available, and then you have a big problem. So even though this is something you could do in Nautilus, or sort of in the graphical file system, it's worth learning the commands. So let's go ahead and talk about the first command that we've talked about is pwd, and I think this is one that we've already introduced before. But pwd stands for print working directory, and what this is going to do is this is going to give you the full path of the place that you are currently logged into. Let me just go ahead and turn this off. So you can see that right now I'm in the downloads directory, and I know this because it says downloads right here. But if I want to know where I am relative to the root level of the file system, if I type pwd, it can show me where I am. Okay. the next thing that I want to show you guys is how to create a directory. So I'm going to go ahead and type cd with no arguments at all, and this is going to get me back to my home directory. So here I am. You can tell that there's a little tilde there, so I'm back in my home directory. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the command mkdir, which stands for make directory or make dir. So if I type mkdir and then what it's going to do is it's going to expect one argument here, and that argument is the name of the directory that I want to create. So if I'm just going to type testdir here. For lack of any better ideas, it's just a directory that where it's if you're used to using a graphical file system, you think of this as a folder. It's the same sort of concept. So let me do an ls, and you can see that right now I've got something right here called testdir. And if I want to, I can cd into testdir. There it is. And if I do a pwd, it can show me where I am. So congratulations, if you've done this, you have now created your first Linux directory. Now, one of the things that we're going to be doing in this chapter is creating files and moving them around. And the easiest way to do that is with a command called touch, which I guess I should put over here. This is actually not a command that the book mentions, but it's something that's really useful for what we're going to be doing. So let me show you guys how it works. If I decide I'm going to touch is a command that, well, it does a couple different things, but for now, let's just say that if I say touch and then I give it a file name, it's going to create that file. That file is going to be empty, so it doesn't really, there's nothing in there. If I cat it out, which we can do in a minute, you're going to see that it doesn't really have much of anything in there at all. If I cat file1, it's just a blank file. But if I do an ls, you can see that I've actually got a file there. This is a great way to create a bunch of files if we're trying to actually mess around with text files without deleting something important. So that's why I'm showing this to you guys. So let me go back here and show you a couple other things here, and that is the command mv lets you move a file. So let's say that I have, remember, I'm in my home directory right here, and I'm going to go ahead and touch file2. So if I've got something like this, you can see that what I have is I've got my test directory that I created right here, and then I've got a file just called file2 that's right here. If I want to move, let's say that I meant to actually sort of create that file inside testdir instead of inside my home directory. Well, is there a way to move it? Yes, there is, and it's with the mv command, which stands for move. So if I type mv and then I type file2, I'm telling Linux that what I want it to do is move file2 to some place. So now I have to tell it what that place is. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say testdir, and then it's going to figure out that it should just take file2 and put it inside testdir. Okay, so if I do something like that, and then I do an ls here, you can see that file2 is not there anymore. If I go ahead and cd into testdir and then do an ls, you can see that that file has been moved into this directory. Okay, now there's a couple other things that I want to show you guys with mkdir and with touch and with mv, because they all work in basically the same way. That is, when I tell it, if I go back to my home directory and I say touch file3, it's going to know that where that file is located in the file system is in home gsmith file3. So there's home gsmith and then file3. But I didn't actually have to type home gsmith file3. I just told it to touch file3, and it figured out where to put it based on where I was in the file system, right? So if I had cd'd to say tmp, for example, and then I said touch file4, it's not going to put that in my home directory. It's going to put that in tmp, because that's where I am at the time. Okay, so it's going to, by default, touch is going to use what it refers to as relative path names. And we talked about what relative path names were, and it was either chapter 2 or 3. Now I don't remember off the top of my head, but this idea that it's going to, if we don't start the file name with a slash, it's going to assume that it wants this to put it where we are, right? So, but if I don't want to do that, I can actually type out a full path name. So to go back to this example, I can be in /tmp, and if I say touch home gsmith file 5, it's going to go ahead and do that, and I should be able to go back to home gsmith and file 5 should be here, and sure enough it is. Now make dir and mv are going to work the same way. In other words, I can say mv file 3 to test dir, and it's going to move that. But if I'm somewhere else, let's say I'm in var, for some reason I'm in var, I can say, oh, you know what, I meant to move that file, so I'm going to say mv home gsmith file 5 to home gsmith test dir. Okay, this is still going to work. This is going to do exactly what I want it to do. But if I just typed move file 5 without giving it the full path, it's going to look for file 5 where I am, which is in var. And if file 5 isn't there, it's going to come back and give me an error message. So if I did something like this, it's going to tell me, hey, that doesn't exist. All right. So one of the things I want you guys to be aware of when you're using, and this is true for a lot of the commands when we're getting around a file system. If we're talking about mkdir, if we're talking about touch, if we're talking about mv, we'll talk about we'll use CP and RM, or the same sort of format that that we use here. They're expecting you to either type in a relative path name or an absolute path name, and you're gonna need to understand the difference between these things so you know how the command is sort of expecting to work. All right, so that's probably about all we need to talk about for that. We're going to go ahead and get into some of the other commands in the next video.